So I was having a long discussion with an old friend this morning, somebody from my old neighborhood. So we have the same starting place roughly in life. And so at this late date, it's interesting to see how much in alignment we are. But we also diverge in some very important ways. And one of the most important to me is the Ukraine war, why it started, who's responsible, what it means, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. I believe that the Ukraine war is the moment, that where you stand on the Ukraine war, what you believe that we should do, how you assign blame, all that is our test of history. And to my dismay, I feel like so many people are failing that test. I was raised by people who were on the right side of history, who took the right side of history very seriously. So these are people that, you know, fought to integrate lunch counters, who marched with Martin Luther King, who lived in community to reduce the footprint of humanity on the planet, save the environment, um, who fought against, the Vietnam War or protested. They were nonviolent, so they didn't really fight. um, who lived in a Black neighborhood to help integrate, to give back, racial reconciliation. They were Mennonites. If you don't know who Mennonites are, a little bit more liberal than Amish, so pretty conservative people. But they came around um, fast for them, especially, but in the 90s to, you know, gay rights and eventually gay marriage. And so I've always had this mission, this worldview that there is a right side of history. And to me, that's playing out right now in the Ukraine war and what you believe or don't believe about it and why it started. From my perspective, it's really straightforward. The Ukrainians for centuries have suffered horribly under the Russians. And when the USSR broke up in the 90s, they formed their own country. They could have held on to their nuclear weapons. They did not. They gave up their nuclear weapons. And since that time, yes, they have a lot of corruption, but you have to understand when people say that Ukraine is corrupt, it's Russian corruption. And if you're asking them not to resist the Russians, you're not asking them to give up corruption. You're asking them to let corruption win. So they've had this division in their own society up until the Ukraine war, that those that wanted to stay with the old system, which was corrupt, and those that wanted to move to the West. And there was enough of them that wanted to move to the West that they had the Maidan Revolution in 2012, that they kicked out the Russian-backed president, the traitor who was taking the bidding of Putin and the Kremlin over the wishes of his own people, right? And this is where people will equivocate and say that was regime change. They'll blame it on America. Like, we had enough influence in Ukraine to get hundreds of thousands of people to come from all over the country and to risk their lives. They're called the Heavenly 100. Over 100 people were killed in Maidan Square resisting the police. Hillary Clinton had that much sway, right? It's strange credibility. And so because the Russians couldn't have that political movement on their doorstep, they couldn't have that resistance on their doorstep, they couldn't have their corrupt way of life, their totalitarian way of life challenged like that, right? If Ukraine stays a puppet state of Russia, the Russians don't invade, right? That's all you need to know. They stood up to the Russians, and that's why the Russians invaded. But here I'm talking to my friend, and my friend has a different take on it. And it's NATO's fault. It's the lack of taking diplomatic options, and it's the military industrial complex, right? That shadowy thing that I don't, disagree doesn't exist, in some shape or form. But it's not Putin, who bombed his own people, killed almost 400, injured up to 1,000 in what are called the Russian apartment bombings. Just do a quick Wikipedia on it. It's very clear. He bombed his own people to consolidate his power, blamed it on the Chechens, started the Second Chechen War. Horrible atrocities in that war, but it galvanized the people behind him. So here's Putin, who just steps onto the stage, killing his own people, and he's not to blame. It's Joe Biden and the military industrial complex, right? It strains credulity. And so it's this information overwhelm, right? It's all these people, and I know I'm one of them, competing for, bandwidth. But what I'm offering is that if anything can come of the present moment, look at where things are darkest. Look at where things are the most bleak. Look at the cultures that have no freedoms whatsoever. In Russia, you can't hold up a piece of blank paper without going to jail for 6 years. They've kidnapped tens of thousands of Ukrainian children and forcibly sent them to Russia to be adopted by parents. I hope every last one of them is loving, but this is Russia. It's not going to be the case. These kids are basically going to be slaves. The Russians bombed intentionally a children's hospital. In Syria, Syria is flaring up in the news again. The Russians not only intentionally bombed hospitals, but they double tapped hospitals. So you bomb a hospital, you can say, oh, that was off course. We didn't mean to. But when you double tap a hospital, you're an evil motherfucker. They would bomb hospitals in Syria, and then they would wait for the rescue workers to come and they would hit them a second time. It's called a double tap. And then people say, oh, Russia had to do it because of NATO encroachment. And it's like you're double tapping hospitals in Syria. You bombed your own people. You shot down an airliner, and we still let you have, the World Cup and the Winter Olympics, and you have a right to, be suspicious of us because of what? Right? We talked the Ukrainians into giving up their nuclear weapons, and you have, right? It's like it's these messages that people get to put people to sleep. The world is easier if I take this line. The world's easier if it's America's fault. Because after all, it's safe to stand up to the American government, right? Like you look at all these alt-left journalists that beat up on the American government all day, and it's the CIA and the intelligence services and all that fucking bullshit. Right? And you can't hold up a blank sheet of paper in Russia without going to jail for 6 years. It's the fallacy of the easy target, right? I've been trying to compose this, but it's just, a product of the very information overwhelm that I'm talking about. We have to we have to know where it's darkest, and we have to look at that darkness, right? I mean, look at the Russia is getting together with North Korea. Imagine that the Nazis converted to Scientology. That's North Korea. The Russians, North Korea, Iran, who beats women to death because they want to take a headscarf off. There was an economic conference that Putin had. It was like within the last 2 years, but nobody could show up because of the Ukraine war and because he's a wanted war criminal because he kills children and kidnaps children on purpose. This isn't collateral damage. This is part of his strategy. And the only world leader that was able to show up was the leader of Equatorial Guinea, who is such a brutal dictator that he eats his own political rivals. He eats their brains and he eats their testicles. He has people skinned alive. And if you go to his country, it is like one of the most orderly countries in Africa, just in terms of day-to-day behavior, because everybody is scared stiff of the man. He's a cannibal. And he's the only one that shows up to this economic conference that Putin has. And so I've been having a hard time getting this one organized today. But what I thought I'd do is share my screen and just show you something real quick. So this is one of the guys that my friend mentioned, Glenn Greenwald. I looked him up because I hadn't really heard him before, just in passing. And I guess Glenn Greenwald cut his teeth, reporting on Iraq War and um, the Patriot Act and all that stuff. But one of these guys that, right, they make a name for themselves calling out the American government, which again is this fallacy of an easy target. Show me the journalist that has been assassinated by any American leader, even Trump, even Bush, even Reagan, right? Versus the hundreds that are known, to have fallen out of windows and be shot in the back and end up in Siberia and killed with nerve agent in Russia, right? So Glenn Greenwald, I mean, it takes some balls to take on the U.S., government and the spy agencies and all that, but it doesn't take, right? That's not even half the balls it takes to hold up a blank sheet of paper in Russia. So this is him, and it's why Glenn Greenwald backs Putin. Um, and I've read into him a little bit, and even these are going too soft. Let me show you what you get when you look at Glenn Greenwald and um, Russia Today. See how quick all this Russia Today comes up? And so it's just every time I look into one of these guys that are making apologies for the Russians, they have ties to Russia Today, or they have ties to something called the Danube Institute, which is in Budapest. It's a think tank, but um, Hungary is a proxy state of um, Russia. And so if you're taking Danube Institute money, you're essentially taking Russian money. Just look into who Viktor Orban is, how he's running the country, how he is basically installed himself as a dictator, all the billions of dollars he's held up in Ukraine aid, and how he's a Putin puppet. And if you're Peter Boghossian, you are a Russian agent. Fuck you. Um, and so here, RT International, RT International, RT International. And these are, that's November 21st, 2024. So, shit, just 2 weeks ago. And so this is who my friend is listening to, thinking that they are listening to somebody on the left. But Glenn Greenwald goes on the Tucker Carlson show. And Tucker Carlson took 73 seconds to accuse Ukraine of blowing up that dam. That dam would be the Novakhovka Dam, which everybody knows the Russians detonated, killing hundreds of people. Here, this is the AP. Russian covered up and undercounted the true human cost of floodings after dam explosion. At least 100 people were drowned to death. Thousands of people lost their houses. The bomb goes off, and it takes 71 seconds for Tucker Carlson. Anyway, so we know who Tucker is, right? Um, Tucker, carries water, runs interference for Putin. Here's Putin. Putin's planes took Ukrainian kids into coerced Russian adoption. This is a Yale report. This came out just in the last few days. They hacked the computers in the Kremlin and they found hundreds of files that show that the Russians have been stealing Ukrainian kids. And so it's known that there are at least 20,000, could be as high as 500,000. And so when you're Glenn Greenwald and you're hanging out with Tucker Carlson, and we know Tucker Carlson is um, a Russian agent at this point, and then you're my friend who thinks he's getting solid information from the left on Glenn Greenwald, you see how Russian information acts. I don't know how they've incentivized Glenn Greenwald. I don't know if it's just that he's made a name for himself speaking out against the US government, and so he can only have so many, right? He has to have a focus, and they fan his flame somehow. They put him on Russia Today, they boost his, social media accounts, or if they just straight up paid him off in private and he's been able to, you know, convince himself, through this amazing capacity that people have for false equivalency. Find some little thing about the US government and, oh, US and Russia is the same, and Russia is just looking out for its self-interest, and it's really American, imperialism and capitalism, blah, 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 blah. Show me all the kids that the Americans have kidnapped, blah, 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 blah. Show me all the hospitals that we've double tapped, blah, 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 blah. Right? Um, and so it's just fucking sad. I'm just so sad in this moment, that somebody I love, from my perspective, yeah, I could be wrong. I don't think I am, but I could be wrong. Is, you know, delivering to my own ears a message that comes straight from the Kremlin, comes from the Kremlin through Glenn Greenwald to my friend, to my ears. And I see it. I see the pattern, right? The um, Heritage Foundation, which are the architects of Project 2025, which is the most powerful right-wing think tank in America, um, who Trump is tapping for very important cabinet positions, who has gone on, all in with Trump, who used to support Ukraine, but when they started supporting Trump, flipped on Ukraine. They're doing all their business through the Danube Institute. Again, that's Viktor Orban's think tank in Budapest. Viktor Orban is the Kremlin's man. Therefore, the Heritage Foundation is in bed with the Kremlin. Therefore, all of the right wing is in bed with the Kremlin, but they've also bought out useful idiots on the left who then weaken Ukraine's position and also weaken the Democratic Party because you will, anyways. Like, fuck, it's right fucking there. It's right there. And all you have to do is have a real moral compass. Let it be the north, the south, whatever it is, point to true evil, and then you will know where true good is. And then you will be able to disambiguate based on what people say their concerns are. I'm not mad necessarily. Glenn Greenwald can have these positions, right? You can be against the Patriot Act and you can be against the CIA and you can be against American interventionism, but you need to also then be against Russia and everything Russia has done, and you're not. And that's where you tip your hand and you show me your cards and you've been compromised on some level. You too, Matt Taibbi. You too, Jimmy Dore. You too, Peter Boghossian. You've all failed this moment in history.